In 2014, the most important event in human history occurred, shaking the foundations of society to its very core and bringing seismic changes in our way of life. A man talked about video games on the internet. He also picked some over others in categories he made up. Such a scene shall never be forgotten, burned into the pages of history, forever carved into mountainous edifices for all to see in untold generations to come. The world is not prepared for another titanic event of such proportions, but fate has decided it will come to pass. Welcome to the second Arbitrary Video Game Awards. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second Arbitrary Video Game Awards. This is our end-of-year video for the channel, wrapping up a bunch of stuff arbitrarily that happened in 2015 and giving out fairly meaningless awards in categories that I just came up with off the top of my head. I haven't really changed the format around too much from last year. People really seemed to enjoy it and the video did really well, so we're doing it again in the same way, although I have changed a few categories. Some of the categories from 2014 will not be returning, mostly because I can't think of good nominees for them. I have introduced a few new categories in order to fill the gaps. But as per last year, the categories are purely arbitrary, the nominations purely arbitrary, and the winners, of course, purely arbitrary. As with last year's show, the focus of this particular awards video is the discussion of why these games are on the list. I do truly believe that awards have no value unless you are given the reasons as to why something was nominated in the first place. Explaining the reasoning behind the awards is what gives them any sort of importance whatsoever. The hope after this video is that you are entertained, you maybe learned a few things, and hopefully got an idea as to why I thought certain things deserved certain accolades, or indeed, criticism. The categories for the 2015 Arbitrary Awards are as follows. We have a return, of course, of Best Soundtrack, something I'm very passionate about. Best Thing to Come Out of Crowdfunding has made its return. And, of course, the ever-popular Stop Preordering Videogames Award for Biggest Launch Disaster, which was, surprisingly enough, a little bit harder to find nominees for in 2015, so good job, games industry. A new award for Graphical Powerhouse, the award for Best Visual Fidelity, has been introduced alongside Most Striking Aesthetic. I felt it fairly important to distinguish the two things, and I think that both of those considerations deserve individual recognition. The game that most surpassed my expectations will be followed by the Sharpened Pitchfork Award for Dodgiest Games Company of the Year, because we don't want to get too positive. I've introduced a new category for recognizing what I view to be the Developer of the Year, very much based on their actions in 2015 as well as the product that they produce. And of course, we will be seeing the return of the game that most needs to see the light of GabeN and be ported to PC and saved from its console torment. Finally, two new categories include the Contrarian Award for the game that I didn't like as much as everyone else did, and the It's Finally Done Award for Best Game to Come Out of Steam Early Access. The order of these awards is, of course, purely arbitrary, but if you wish to skip to any of the award segments, there are annotations on the screen right now, as well as timestamps in the video description below, which will allow you to find the content that you so desire. Without further ado, let us begin with nominations for Best Soundtrack. Best Soundtrack. Undertale. It became abundantly clear as to just how much the soundtrack for this game resonated with a large group of people when I started to hear cuts of it in videos all over YouTube. Toby Fox has created a varied soundtrack of synth and chiptuned inspired retro goodness. The music that you would find in Undertale would not be out of place in Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis classics. The soundtrack to Undertale truly runs the gamut when it comes to the different emotions that it inspires. There are plenty of themes which drive you towards victory and, of course, inspire determination. There are sorrowful themes, mournful themes, whimsical themes, and themes that just make you smile. The proliferation of excellent covers and remixes to be found on YouTube of the various popular tracks that this game features is truly a testament to just how much it resonated and really how good the bass composition actually is. You've heard no doubt the phrase that you can't polish a turd. In order to create great remixes, you usually have to have a solid bass to work with. And in the case of the Undertale soundtrack, it's all really good anyway. If I had one criticism to make of the Undertale soundtrack, it's that many of the themes are simply very short, perhaps by necessity, considering that, unbelievably, the entire soundtrack was composed and created by the developer himself. Personal preference or not, you've got to admit that's pretty impressive. There came an echo. The combined efforts of Big Giant Circles, who, amongst his original work, is also very well known for his video game remixes, and Ronald Jenkins, an artist that perhaps rose to fame through very early YouTube viral recognition, results in a soundtrack that simply hits all the right buttons for me. Whether it be the racy and driving electronic combat themes of tracks such as LAX, or the haunting piano-centric electronica of the Echo, Big Giant Circle's contribution to the soundtrack is unsurprisingly excellent, and when paired with Ronald Jenkins, who contrary to public perception actually did work closely with the developers on creating the first 6 tracks for his album that was later released as an independent project, you have a mix of really enjoyable music that fits the game incredibly well and suits its futuristic aesthetic. To me, one of the defining aspects of a great video game soundtrack is the ability to completely divorce the music from the game entirely and still have it stand on its own 2 feet. I think that both Ronald Jenkins and Big Circle's contributions to There Came an Echo thoroughly qualify under that criteria, particularly considering that Ronald Jenkins' album was indeed released independently after the fact. This stuff is great, and I listen to it on a regular basis. Gravity Ghost. Ben Prunty perhaps shot to relative fame within the PC gaming scene when he created the soundtrack to indie hit FTL. Music for that game was suitably sci-fi and helped to build the tension of dangerous life-or-death battles while complementing rather than clashing with the pixel art aesthetic. Ben Prunty is also responsible for the soundtrack to Gravity Ghost, which, to me, is a great example of the evolution of his style. In this case, it's a very whimsical soundtrack, but it's chock full of Ben Prunty's trademark use of discordance, as well as unusual and kind of weird synth pad effects. While being a wonderful game, Gravity Ghost was, sadly for the most part, overlooked. I think that's a real shame. Ben Prunty's original soundtrack for the game is perhaps unusual, featuring sounds, rhythms, and harmonies that you perhaps would not expect, and yet it somehow gels very well with the aesthetic and overall theme of the game, and being able to do that with something that unusual is to be commended. Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain. I honestly debated as to whether or not to nominate this because I think there is a fundamental difference between original game soundtracks and those that use licensed music. The water is further clouded when you have a game like Metal Gear Solid 5, which includes plenty of original compositions, but also features iconic classic tracks suitable to the time period from licensed, and in many cases very famous artists. It seems almost like an unfair comparison to put the two in the same category, and it's something that I'm still debating. But in 2015, I think it's hard to argue that Metal Gear Solid 5 deserves a place on an overall soundtrack nomination list. Whether or not all of the music was original is not necessarily what matters. It's how appropriate the soundtrack actually was to the game itself, and perhaps more so than anything else on this list, Metal Gear Solid 5 picks just the right music to immerse you into the alt history time period. Quite similar, of course, to the way that Wolfenstein: The New Order in 2014 utilized German covers of iconic popular songs of the period. While tracks such as The Man Who Sold the World by David Bowie may take center stage, it's important not to forget the contributions of the composers Ludwig Forssell, Justin Burnett, and Daniel James. The producer for the soundtrack for The Phantom Pain is, of course, Harry Gregson Williams, who has not only contributed to several Metal Gear Solid titles, but has made significant contributions to the film industry and worked with legends such as Hans Zimmer. When you think of games over the past few years that have used licensed music well, I think that Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain does have to be pretty high up that list. Hotline Miami 2, wrong number. How can we have a soundtrack category that does not mention Hotline Miami in some form? The sequel to the indie hit Hotline Miami may of course not have been as well received by some people as the original, but the soundtrack is varied, discordant, down, dirty, and thoroughly appropriate for what's going on screen. When it comes to a huge lineup of fairly obscure artists, Hotline Miami blew us all out of the water, and Miami 2 contains even more variety in that regard. I think it would not be unfair to argue that both Hotline Miami games have actually been fairly influential on players in terms of opening their horizons to music that they would not have necessarily considered looking into beforehand. It's also worth noting that having such a wide variety of artists and yet have the soundtrack work with the aesthetic and the themes that you're seeing on screen so well is a very difficult challenge, and yet somehow both Hotline Miami and Miami 2 managed to do that with a wide variety of different artists contributing. There's a big difference, I feel, between varied soundtracks with a lot of artists where the music is very much optional, such as Grand Theft Auto with its radio stations, and a game which uses a wide variety of artists as the actual soundtrack to the levels themselves. The soundtrack is not so much optional within Hotline Miami 2, and that's where the difficulty lies, which is why I'm so impressed with how they managed to put it all together. Now, as in last year's Arbitrary Awards, before declaring the winner, I would like to talk a little bit more about the category itself and the process of choosing. The soundtrack category is always a difficult one, considering just how subjective musical preference actually is, and there's a wide variety of factors to consider. There are no doubt plenty of other games that could have very easily been slipped into this category, and many people will disagree with the choices themselves. And even within my own personal musical preferences, it's still hard to make the final call considering how many of these games went above and beyond just having good music. Lots of games have good music. Not many games, for instance, are as capable of creating tracks which I feel will be iconic for years to come in the style of VGM classics of old. The Undertale is a game that absolutely manages to do that. I feel that some of the music in that soundtrack is on the level of classics such as Bloody Tears, Chemical Plant Zone, At Doom's Gate, and many more besides. That to me was, of course, a very strong aspect in deciding the winner, but there are other factors as well that I find to be equally and perhaps even more important. The ability of the soundtrack to stand on its own divorced from the game, which There Came an Echo was very capable of, the unusual nature of the music, such as in Gravity Ghost, or the very appropriate choices of licensed music, such as in Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain, which to me very much echoes what some of the most iconic films and television shows have done when it comes to the use of licensed music. It takes a lot of skill, I think, to get your piece of media, your personal creation, associated with something else that was created previously and not by you. The idea that perhaps we associate Gears of War with the song Mad World, Where Is My Mind with the end of Fight Club, the times they are a-changin' with Watchmen and so on and so forth. It's not as easy as just pick good song and shove it in form of media. And of course, you've got to take into account, again, the diversity of the lineup of Hotline Miami 2 and its role in promoting fairly obscure indie artists. They're all really, really good. And I imagine quite a few people are going to disagree with my overall decision for this because I'm going to give it to their Cayman Echo. A lot of this comes down to personal preference. I like absolutely every track in this game. There was not a single piece of music within the entire soundtrack from either of the major artists involved that I dislike. I listen to them on a regular basis, and yet I haven't touched the game since finishing it a few days after it came out. The game was good. The soundtrack was absolutely incredible. I made the mistake of believing earlier in the year that all the Ronald Jenkins contributions to this game were actually written beforehand and released as part of an album and then just borrowed for the game, but as he personally told me, that was actually not true. They were written in collaboration, and they were written quite some time before the album actually came out. As for Big Giant Circles, well, he's been around for a long time and yet is perhaps not a particularly well-known composer for video games, and yet you might be surprised to hear about the amount of involvement he's had. The music that he makes strictly of his own accord is fantastic, and everything that he contributes to video games has, for me, always improved the title that his music was included in. He's one of the few artists that I will go out of my way to seek out when thinking about which video games I want to play. As a result of that, and just the presence that the There Came an Echo soundtrack has on my regular playlist is something that I willingly listen to for no other reason than I just enjoy it so much. There Came an Echo receives the Best Soundtrack Award in 2015. Best thing to come out of crowdfunding. The nominations for the best thing to come out of crowdfunding are as follows. Satellite Rain. This game by 5 Live Studios raised £461,000, working out to just under 700,000 US dollars. Up until 2015, it was fairly difficult to be a fan of the Syndicate franchise, simply because the franchise barely even got started. After an incredible and innovative release that pushed the boundaries in terms of depth, mechanics, and even aesthetic in 1993, the game received an expansion pack and then an eventual sequel that had moved to full 3D. At which point, the franchise vanished off the face of the planet, despite its excellent critical reception. Despite the eventual demise of developer Bullfrog being pointed to as one of the main reasons why the franchise had not continued, sources at Bullfrog actually claimed that there were several other attempts to create Syndicate games. According to an anonymous source claiming to be a former Bullfrog and EA employee, a statement on Kotaku claimed that once Dungeon Keeper 2 had been completed, there were attempts to create another PC Syndicate title, as well as a version of the game for PlayStation 2, which had some concept art leaked quite some time ago, but never really got any further than that. The so-called reboot of the franchise in 2012 resulted in the tactical isometric action game being converted into a first-person shooter that, while on its own was not a bad game and had some interesting ideas, was not the Syndicate follow-up that fans were hoping for. The game received middling reviews and was not met with commercial success, and it certainly seemed that any hope of really seeing a true Syndicate successor had thoroughly disappeared. Enter 5 Lives with Satellite Rain that promised a spiritual successor to the title, headed up by Mike Diskett, who was the director behind Syndicate Wars, the 3D successor to the original title. Certainly not the most financially successful game Kickstarter that we've seen, but backed up by strong concept art and solid technology demos which showed a neon-infused cyberpunk aesthetic which was thoroughly suited to Syndicate's corporate dystopian future, the game garnered enough hardcore support to raise the money required, and after a fairly lengthy period in early access, Satellite Rain was released to good reviews and was able to create an experience which was suitably inspired by Syndicate without cloning it outright. These isometric real-time tactical games were a genre that I certainly thought had very much died off with the end of the Syndicate and Commandos franchises. They are not a genre that is suitable to console or the mass market, and it's really as a result of Kickstarter that Satellite Rain was able to come into being, and thankfully I'm very much glad it did. It's a game that is thoroughly niche, hardcore, and does not shy away from complexity. A collection of well-implemented systems and player freedom, accented very nicely by exactly the sort of aesthetic and look that you would expect from a Syndicate title. Undertale. Quite a few people don't really know that Undertale was a title that was kickstarted, raising a total of $51,124 with a campaign beginning in 2013. It was a successful, if somewhat minor, Kickstarter that was overshadowed by the much bigger names, the titans of crowdfunding, and yet out comes Undertale at the end of it, being one of the most notable and interesting titles of 2015. I don't know, with the advent of social media and the immediacy of the internet, that it's even possible to have a so-called sleeper hit anymore, but if it is, Undertale is very much the definition of that, and it stands very much as one of the gold standards when it comes to seeing just how much one developer can really do on his own. If there was an award for return on investment, considering how relatively little this title cost to make, Undertale would be running away with it right now. According to Steam Spy, this game has sold almost 500,000 copies, and it is one of the few games to have achieved a 98% positive user review rating on Steam, joining games such as Portal, the original Counter-Strike, and Crypt of the Necrodancer. Toby Fox proves that given the right ideas and just a little bit of passion, a lot can be made of a little. Pillars of Eternity. One of the highest profile game launches and indeed most financially successful games on Kickstarter ever, raised a staggering $3.98 million. Obsidian Entertainment are hardly an unknown studio, and they were certainly not using Kickstarter to bring their first game to life. The combination of the reputation, perhaps, that Obsidian had built through a number of excellent releases, as well as the promise that Pillars of Eternity would be a spiritual successor to the Black Isle RPGs of old, such as Baldur's Gate, Planescape Torment, and Icewind Dale, made sure that this Kickstarter got a hell of a lot of attention. With that attention, of course, comes higher expectations, especially considering the budget of this title, and Pillars of Eternity was able to deliver. To me, Pillars of Eternity represents exactly what I would expect from a modernized version of Black Isle's RPGs of old. It is a classic CRPG, brought up to date with a solid interface and an incredible world, an original world at that, filled with excellent characters, stories, content, and themes that takes an incredibly long time to finish. Kickstarter games have a reputation for perhaps delivering a solid product that's a little thin on the ground. This usually comes down to budget mismanagement and feature creep, and yet Pillars of Eternity somehow managed to dodge those things and release what was obviously a complete and content-rich product. Just as with 2014's Wasteland 2, Kickstarter once again enables a niche genre of old to release a game in 2015 that was not only critically acclaimed, but a commercial success, despite prevailing industry opinion that that genre was simply a relic of days past. Hand of Fate. This is a card game combined with a 3D brawler combined with some nice roguelite elements, and it's from a developer called Defiant, who was able to raise 54,000 Australian dollars to bring this game to life. Considering the past developments of that company, including only 2 mobile games, it was perhaps surprising that a small Australian indie team without a huge pedigree was able to find funding and interest. But I suppose the concept of this game very much resonated, and the end of 2013 was maybe the ideal time to try and crowdfund something with these particular elements. procedural generation, card gaming, and of course the promise of infinite replayability due to its random and roguelite elements seemed to strike a chord, and it resulted in funding as well as a successful early access release. It also happens to be the only title on this year's nominations that was able to find its way off of the PC platform, with releases on PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. While certainly not the best 3D brawler, Hand of Fate does an almost peerless job of giving a real face to the game's challenges, presented to you by a mysterious dealer who consistently comments on your journey while both helping and hindering your progress. Excellent presentation, as well as this particular narrative conceit, helped keep me hooked far longer than I would have expected. Sunless Sea. This roguelite game focused on exploration and narrative was created by Fail Better, who were able to raise £100,000, around 160,000 US dollars, to fund something of a successor to their web-based narrative game Fallen London. Based on the cult popularity of Fallen London, it seems that support was able to be gathered in relatively large numbers for this roguelite title that really put a focus on the in-game lore as well as storytelling, whereas previous roguelite experiences had more of a focus on replayability and game mechanics. Sunless Sea is about as far away from the Isaacs and Nuclear Thrones of the genre as you could possibly imagine. It's a game set in a world of incredible mystery with a relatively slow pace, to the point where some people actually found the game rather dull. I personally was entranced with its world, and it helps that they had a very deep well of stories and lore to dip into with their title Fallen London. Of all of the game worlds that I've been able to experience this year, Sunless Sea is certainly a top contender for the one that intrigued me the most. Crowdfunding has, for the last few years, of course, been a topic mired in controversy as a result of broken promises, various failures, and expectations not being met. Despite that, and just how inherently risky it is to throw money at a promise as opposed to a real finished product, Kickstarter does result in titles that we would not have otherwise seen, and on that basis, it's hard to turn around and claim that despite its inherently risky nature, it's bad for the games industry. As somebody that enjoys many core genres that have perhaps been abandoned in recent years, Kickstarter has, without a doubt, resulted in the revival of franchises and genres and particular gameplay styles that I actually do enjoy. All of the games on this list are great, there's no doubt about that, but when it comes to deciding the winner, I think I have to focus, perhaps more so than anything, on which of these titles was the biggest success and would have been absolutely impossible to develop via conventional means in 2015. As a result, I think I have to give this award to Pillars of Eternity. The sheer scale of Pillars of Eternity is what makes this game so difficult to replicate conventionally. That's not to say that there aren't RPGs that offer huge amounts of content, but it's the way that they offer that content which is fundamentally different to Pillars of Eternity. Titles such as Witcher 3 and of course last year's Dragon Age Inquisition are appealing to a larger audience and have more relatable game mechanics and a focus, of course, on high-tech graphical fidelity. They are extremely expensive games to make, and while they're good RPGs in their own right, Pillars of Eternity was created at a fraction of that budget and a focus on the CRPG elements of the game at the expense of perhaps everything else. That's not a compromise that most game development companies seem to be willing to make these days. Rather than dumbing down and simplifying, Pillars of Eternity turned the ante up because they knew that that's what their backers wanted. Pillars of Eternity delivers on its promise and its vision. Alongside Divinity Original Sin and Wasteland 2, it is at the vanguard of truly pushing a genre that many of us grew up with right back into focus and proving that yes, this is actually something we want to play. The Stop Preordering Videogames Award for Biggest Launch Disaster. The nominations for the Stop Preordering Video Game Award for Biggest Launch Disaster are as follows. Batman Arkham Knight PC release. If this category were to be judged purely by the amount of noise caused by this particular launch botch, then Arkham Knight would win outright immediately. The PC release of the much-anticipated Batman Arkham Knight was in fact farmed out to Iron Galaxy. Upon release, a title that many gamers viewed as a surefire winner was in fact a broken mess. The PC version was plagued with inexplicable performance problems across a wide variety of platforms, with low frame rates being the least of the game's issues. In fact, the title was subject to downright freezing at many points throughout the game. YouTube videos of this are very clear when demonstrating the absolute unplayable nonsense that many gamers were faced with upon purchasing this full-priced AAA release. What made this disaster even more noteworthy is that the game was, in an unprecedented move, pulled from sale on Steam a mere day after its release. The game was unavailable for purchase for months before being reintroduced to Steam fairly recently. However, the game is still, despite various patches, plagued with performance problems that, in fact, the developer admits may not be fixable. Batman Arkham Knight stands as a warning against blind franchise loyalty. It was heavily pre-ordered, despite the fact that previous Arkham releases on PC had also suffered problems. The blind belief that Rocksteady would deliver an incredible game and that there was no risk in pre-ordering was based in falsehood, and indeed, as it turned out, Rocksteady had nothing to do with the PC port. This game is also notable for being the first major problematic release after the launch of the Steam automated refund system, and many gamers were thankfully able to take full advantage of it to avoid having lost their $60 on an unplayable piece of tat. Afro Samurai 2. I don't really think that too many people were expecting an awful lot from the second Afro Samurai game. However, they were perhaps not expecting one of the worst games of the year. This is a title that was inexplicably episodic and is very unlikely to now be finished, entitled Revenge of Kuma Volume 1. This game was universally panned for absolutely broken gameplay and being a technical disaster, one of the worst examples of character action games to have ever been released, and this is in a year where Yasai Ninja exists. The game runs like arse, the camera is absolutely dreadful, spazzing out at perhaps the worst possible moments, and the game is an absolute nightmare to control. What makes this noteworthy is that the publisher Versus Evil made the decision to unpublish the game. They actually pulled it from sale entirely, including physical copies, and offered full refunds for those that bought it. They even went public in interviews stating that they knew the game was absolutely awful, and that they genuinely believed, in order to regain some consumer confidence and be fair to those that bought it, that they needed to give them their money back. An example certainly of ethical publishing, but one has to wonder how something so utterly dreadful was published in the first place. Mortal Kombat 10 PC version. The port of Mortal Kombat 9 to PC was hardly ideal. It was nice that we got it. PC at that point certainly was not exactly inundated with fighting games, and thankfully I think that the release of Mortal Kombat 9 and its relative success most likely resulted in further fighting games being brought to PC, but it certainly was not perfect, suffering from performance issues as well as problems with the online matchmaking. One would have certainly hoped that mistakes would have been learned from with the release of Mortal Kombat 10, although the involvement of High Voltage Software, who is blamed for the PC port problems of Mortal Kombat 9, didn't exactly inspire a huge amount of confidence in the minds of those that knew what they'd done the last time. Unfortunately, Mortal Kombat 10's launch was even worse than 9 on PC, suffering huge problems related to the way that the game was actually downloaded. It used a relatively new system that allowed users to play parts of the game before the full game had been downloaded. However, the developer did not communicate this fact to anybody, and more to the point, the system didn't work. Despite full downloads of the game, many players, myself included on launch day, were treated to being able to play an AI battle with 2 characters or part of the tutorial. Most other modes were either grayed out or simply crashed the game and froze it upon selection. This was eventually resolved, however, the matchmaking and multiplayer with the game continued to suffer problems, as well as performance issues on a wide variety of platforms, and of course, the last thing that you want with a fighting game are performance problems. While the game has certainly improved since launch, it continues to suffer issues with the multiplayer, and certainly with its cross-platform play. And it didn't really endear itself to PC gamers by forging ahead with relatively expensive character DLC, while the game continued to be a rather subpar experience for many PC users. No doubt as a result of this poor launch, the online community for Mortal Kombat 10 is a lot smaller than it deserves to be. Despite supposedly shifting over 400,000 copies on PC, according to Steam Spy data, the game averages a concurrent player base of around 500, and who knows how many of those are actually playing online. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5. I'll tell you, someone must have painted the blood of the lamb on PC users' doors, because we were thankfully passed over for this abomination of a supposedly revived veteran franchise. Tony Hawk is, of course, regarded by many people, even those that don't like sports games, myself included, as being a great example of a goddamn sports game. I have no interest in skateboarding, but I played the hell out of the Tony Hawk series. However, it's safe to say that after Project 8, the series thoroughly face-planted into a concrete floor with the release of Tony Hawk Motion, as well as the god-awful Tony Hawk Ride, which required a massive, expensive, and thoroughly broke-as-all-hell skateboard peripheral. They followed that up and still couldn't get it right with Tony Hawk Shred, which was also equally panned, and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater HD, which seems like a slam dunk if you're remastering one of the most popular sports games ever made, was also not well received. A lot of that perhaps had to do with the change of engine and, as a result, alteration of the physics, which meant the game didn't feel anywhere near as tight or as satisfying to play as the original it was attempting to remaster. Also, no doubt due to licensing issues, only one track in the soundtrack was actually from the original Tony Hawk Pro Skater, with 6 coming from Pro Skater 2, and the other half of the soundtrack having been replaced with completely new songs. I think based on this history, it would be safe to say that hopes were not high for the release of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5, although many were looking forward to a potential return to form for the series in its mainline iteration rather than spin-offs. Warning signs, however, were there for those that cared to look. The game was developed by Robomodo, who were responsible for the infamously awful Tony Hawk Ride and Tony Hawk Shred, as well as the port of Pro Skater HD. In a rather inexplicable and somewhat suspicious move, Activision announced that they had changed the visual style and aesthetic of the title a mere month and a half before the actual game's release. This perhaps was indicative of development problems with the title, and when the game finally came out, having suspiciously denied pre-release review copies to absolutely everybody, it was a disaster. A hilarious technical mess that is incredibly buggy with a physics engine that barely works, and that's at the best of times. The developers' claims that part of the change in art style was to maintain a consistent frame rate were proven false, considering that the game was not capable of doing such a thing. And this content-sparse, unholy, necromantic resurrection of the carcass of a once respected franchise doesn't do skating well. The cardinal sin, perhaps. You can't bloody skate in it. The characters simply don't do what you tell them to do. Pulling off moves is nigh on impossible as a result of just how unpredictable and buggy the physics of this game are. To add insult to injury, this was a full-priced, quote, AAA release. I don't know if you can call this one a launch disaster or stillborn. Either way, if you bought this game, I feel sorry for you. Call of Duty Black Ops 3 PC. Yep, again, we have issues with PC ports of franchises that really should know better. The Call of Duty franchise, while starting on PC, has had a very checkered history when it came to its yearly releases. Some work very well, some do not. Some have the features you would expect from a PC game, some are lacking the ability to not make those affected by simulation sickness vomit due to their incredibly low field of view. Many of them lack dedicated servers, some even lacked text chat because Infinity Ward were arrogant bastards. One way or the other, they should know better by now, and unfortunately Black Ops 3, despite its beta, ended up launching with even worse performance problems on PC than the beta indicated. While it is of course something of a step up in terms of its graphical fidelity, it's very important to ensure smooth gameplay in a multiplayer-focused Twitch shooter such as Black Ops, and the launch week of this game was a mess. Matchmaking problems, server problems, latency problems, and widespread performance issues for this game were, for the most part, rectified, thankfully, with patches since the game's release. However, this was a mess on launch, and when it comes to the goodwill of PC gamers and the Call of Duty franchise, I think they ran out like 5 titles ago. Credit where credit is due. I do not think that 2015 was as bad as 2014. In fact, I think I actually had problems finding more than a few real nominees for this category. It would have been easy just to dig through the shovelware nonsense and Unity asset flips that clog up the Steam store these days, but creating a bad game isn't noteworthy in and of itself anymore. You've got to go one better. Every fiber in my body says I should be giving this award to Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5 for just how absolutely awful a game it is. It is unforgivable that a major publisher like Activision could put out, knowingly, such absolute bollocks. It is an insult to those that enjoyed the franchise. It's an insult to people that like video games, and Activision should be bloody ashamed of itself. However, despite that, this is a category for biggest launch disaster, not just worst game. And as a PC-centric channel, I have to give it to Batman Arkham Knight. This is such an unbelievably unique set of circumstances that may never happen again. It is that noteworthy to see such a large publisher and such a huge franchise take an unprecedented move, such as pulling the game from Steam entirely so soon after its release. It was a highly anticipated game, and it is certainly one of the worst examples of PC ports we have ever seen. As a result of it being such a widespread technical disaster on such a large number of systems, and it being as high profile a release as it was, it's gotta win the award. I wouldn't be a PC gaming channel if I didn't award it to this. It's not a bad game. In fact, half of the nominees in this category aren't bad games. But that is why it stung the most. People cared. And you let them down, guys. You let them down. Stop pre-ordering video games. The Graphical Powerhouse Award for Best Visual Fidelity. The nominations for the Graphical Powerhouse Award for Best Visual Fidelity are as follows. The Witcher 3. I don't think there was any doubt in people's minds that The Witcher 3 would be a damn good-looking game this year, although it was unfortunately mired in controversy regarding a visual downgrade between the E3 presentation and the final release product. While this was certainly the case, it did not prevent Witcher 3 from being an incredibly impressive experience when it came to its graphical fidelity. The Red Engine 3 demonstrates excellent texture quality, a selection of fantastic volumetric effects, including improved smoke and clouds, and implements various NVIDIA technologies such as Hairworks to great visual effect, admittedly, with something of a performance impact. What's perhaps most impressive is the fact that the game does a great job of seamlessly loading all of this stuff in the background as you play. You're not being constantly harassed by loading screens as you move through this large open world, and the game is also surprisingly scalable and very well optimized. It runs well on a wide variety of PC systems, and if you've got the horsepower for it, you can crank this baby all the way up, and it will look incredible. Mad Max. I said it in my video about this game, but let's be frank, rendering a desert isn't too difficult. But you've got to give them props for rendering maybe the best looking desert in any video game ever. Mad Max while it may be sparse in terms of the amount of detail that's on the screen at any given time, makes the most of what's there, with an incredibly lengthy view distance and fantastic particle and weather effects. If you're gonna do a game that is dominated by really only one major terrain type, then you'd bloody well better do it correctly. Thankfully, they do. The sand as it's ground up under your tires or whipped around in a storm looks absolutely fantastic. And what you have here is an excellent evolution on the graphics technology of previous Avalanche games. It's one of the best optimized games of the year on PC, there's no doubt about that, and the level of customization in terms of options allows it to run well on pretty much any platform. That has to be commended for an open world in a game of that size. Star Wars Battlefront. For all of the problems this game has and all of the criticism it has received, one area in which said critique is certainly lacking, and for a good reason, is its graphical fidelity. Frostbite has always looked good as an engine, it's always been capable of doing a lot, but Battlefront really pushes that to the next level. It creates visuals that are almost peerless, and as a result brings you into the universe and lets you experience some of the iconic landscapes of the Star Wars franchise in incredibly high detail. So good does this game look, in fact, that when a 4K video of a Sweet FX modification to the game, which claimed to make it look even better, came out, I found myself scratching my head and saying, you know what, actually it kinda looked good enough to begin with. Say what you want about the rest of the game, and it's probably all valid criticism, but Star Wars has never looked better. Everyone's Gone to the Rapture. Nestled among this list of AAA titles is a game about walking around a town with nobody in it. Everyone's Gone to the Rapture may certainly lack in terms of any real degree of gameplay, but it certainly looks the part. If anyone was to ask me the difficult question of which title most realistically represented a village in Shropshire, I would absolutely have to say Everybody's Gone to the Rapture. That certainly looks like a village in Shropshire. The CryEngine is certainly capable of some incredible things, although it's usually not used to simulate walking around an empty village. Thankfully, as it turns out, it's really quite good at that. Excellent lighting, fantastic texture quality, and just a level of detail when it comes to the small stuff. In a game where you move at the pace of a geriatric snail, it's pretty damn important that the attention to detail is there, because you're going to be spending a great deal of time looking at things. Thankfully, Everybody's Gone to the Rapture certainly looks the part, and ends up, interestingly enough, being one of the most realistic-looking games on the PlayStation 4. Soma. I don't exactly know how Frictional Games manages to make titles look that good and run on a system of incredibly low spec, and yet they manage to do that. The recommended specifications for Soma are a GTX 480M. Yeah, that's a 5-year-old mobile GPU, by the way. Frictional Games has in the past impressed with titles such as Amnesia: The Dark Descent, but I have to say that Soma's lighting, as well as its texture quality and attention to detail, is really quite astonishing. This is an example of an indie studio that, frankly, with a fairly small budget, managed to make something that looks genuinely striking in many ways. Due to its small scale, it may not be as technically impressive as some of the other titles on this list, but it's pretty damn hard to argue that despite its humble origins, Soma really does look the part. The best graphics can be defined in certain objective ways. You can talk about the game that has the highest texture resolution. You can talk about the game that can render the most things at once on screen without falling over itself. You can talk about the various pieces of technology that a game is able to take advantage of, but let's be honest, when it comes to saying best graphics, you're probably going to have to go with a subjective decision. Thankfully, that's what this award show is all about, so I can get away with saying pretty much anything. I'm gonna be honest, had The Witcher 3 not suffered its downgrade between E3 and its release, I probably would have given it to that. But it did, and while it still looks amazing, it doesn't look as amazing as it could have, or as amazing as it was promised. So, as a result, I'm gonna say Star Wars Battlefront. It is one of the only games this year to have had me stop and be genuinely taken aback by the sheer fidelity of what I'm seeing on the screen. That takes a lot of work. I run a Powerhouse PC, and I've seen a lot. I've seen high resolutions, I've seen high frame rates, I've seen great texture quality, I've seen the best that the gaming industry has to offer in terms of making a game look good, and still, Battlefront did make me stop and pause and say, wow, we have come a long bloody way, haven't we? I doubt Battlefront is going to be remembered fondly for any other reason, but I think it's safe to say that it left a pretty high watermark in 2015 as an absolute graphical powerhouse. You're pretty, Battlefront. Ugly on the inside, but pretty. The game that most surpassed my expectations. The nominations for the game that most surpassed my expectations are as follows. Undertale. It would be very easy, I feel, to have ludicrous expectations when it comes to Undertale, such as its rise in niche popularity and cult following. And I do not use the term cult lightly in this instance. Some of you are crazy. Please stop it. If the internet was to be believed, especially over the last few months, the Undertale is literally the second coming of Christ, and he's giving you all free chocolate and iPhones. But thankfully, when I first heard of the Undertale and first started to play it, that was not the case, and I was really only hearing little things here and there from people that I trusted saying, you know, you should probably try this one out. I'm not gonna lie, upon looking at the screenshots, my expectations were low. I get sent a lot of lo-fi games, a lot of retro-inspired titles, and my sheer fatigue when it comes to such titles is pretty damn high. In a twist of fate, I suppose, the act of judging the book by its cover in this situation allowed the game to surpass my expectations very easily indeed. This was a case of expecting nothing so as not to be disappointed. It turns out that going in with that lack of knowledge was exactly the right call. Transformers Devastation. Transformers is, at least in terms of video games, a little unlike most licensed franchises. This is not a series that has actually suffered too much from poor cash-in titles. In fact, the only one in recent memory was Rise of the Dark Spark. The preceding titles, War and Fall of Cybertron, were surprisingly good, I think. Not too many people were expecting a great deal out of them, and yet they surpassed those expectations quite easily, and were lovingly crafted by people that obviously knew what they were doing. Now, when I heard that Platinum, one of my favorite developers of all time, was going to be receiving the Transformers license for a title, I have to admit that my initial excitement was tempered by the tepid release of Legend of Korra, another licensed game which Platinum was responsible for in 2014. My fear was that Platinum was going this way, farming itself out to cheaper, lesser titles that were developed in a shorter time without anywhere near as much thought and skill being put into their crafting. I was further concerned by the game's obvious focus on melee, which is not exactly something that I necessarily associate with the Transformers franchise, and that's probably because I don't remember the early cartoons. One way or the other, thankfully, it was not a Legend of Korra, and it was a Platinum game through and through, making great use of the license, presenting a fantastic and faithful retro aesthetic. This game is a good Platinum game and a great Transformers game. Now I hear that Platinum is working on a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game, and I could not be more excited for something that I otherwise should not in any way care about. Until Dawn. I didn't exactly know what I was getting into when I looked at Until Dawn. In fact, I actually avoided it for quite some time, knowing that it was a game that sacrificed frame rate for graphical fidelity, and that's not something that I'm really okay with. The PlayStation 4 exclusive nature of the title was to me a black mark against it, and honestly, I didn't really feel like it. I'm not the sort of person that enjoys horror, and that was my initial perception of what the game was. A flashy, but poorly performing horror title. It turns out that really only one of those things is true. Yeah, it runs like arse, but it's less of a horror game and more of a choose-your-own-adventure, something of an interactive movie, I guess you could argue, but a title that really embraced the idea of the chaos effect, small decisions having big impact later on, and I am an absolute sucker for that sort of thing when it's well implemented. The game is not necessarily scary, creepy, atmospheric certainly, but not scary, more of an homage to 90s slasher films than anything else. But I found myself surprisingly engaged by it, plenty of tense moments and interesting decisions to make as I decided who I really hated in this group of people and who I only found mildly annoying. One of my guilty pleasures is David Cage games, and this to me seems like the logical evolution with quite a few of the holes filled in when it comes to the David Cage concept of the kind of interactive choose-your-own-adventure movie video game thingy. Rainbow Six Siege. I love Rainbow Six, or at least I did. I loved Rainbow Six until Rainbow Six Vegas, which to me completely defeated the point of the exercise, taking that tense and slow-paced tactical shooter, I mean, the tactical shooter, and turning it into cover-based squad of 3 nonsense with pretty much all of the planning removed in favor of flashy console nonsense. Wasn't exactly holding out a lot of hope for Rainbow Six Siege. As a result of that, Ubisoft in 2014 had done an incredibly poor job of keeping me interested in their franchises, and this did seem to be picking at the carcass of another once great series. I'm very glad to be wrong. Despite the fact that this is a multiplayer-only game at full price, which is certainly putting quite a lot of people off, there is a surprising amount of well-implemented innovation in this game. Rainbow Six Siege has a number of new ideas that are all well implemented to create a very tense, tactical, and team-orientated experience. In fact, it's one of the few games in which I can actually tolerate dying and then having to sit out for the round, because it's surprisingly fun and tense to watch the rest of your team as they try and desperately struggle to win the game. Ubisoft as a publisher is branded, and I would say that this is mostly fair and self-inflicted, as a company that recycles systems, ideas, and mechanics ad nauseum. There is a reason that there are jokes about radio towers whenever a new Ubisoft game is announced. There is a reason why I can't name all of the Assassin's Creed titles, because there are too bloody many of them. Oh god, please stop, it hurts. But as it turns out, with Rainbow Six Siege, it was actually quite a nice surprise. Warhammer Vermintide. This is not a genre that I generally enjoy. Horde-based cooperative games can be very repetitive. I'm fairly outspoken, it seems, in the sense that I don't love Left 4 Dead with every single fiber of my being, as everybody else seems to, and I got a lot of flack from criticizing the sniper elite Nazi zombies nonsense that Rebellion keeps coming out with. I just find the genre in general to be extremely dull, and I don't think that many games do it all that well. That said, there are a couple of rare exceptions, and as it turns out, Vermintide is one of them. It's surprising just how much more fun combat can be when you're up close and personal, relying primarily on melee weapons as opposed to guns with seemingly infinite ammunition. This is a game about getting into the middle of a pack of rat men and chopping them to little pieces, and honestly that does not get all that old, thanks to great player feedback, excellent sound design, and a really engaging loot system that allows you to evolve your character over time. It definitely doesn't hurt that the game is being supported well post-launch with free DLC, as well as many plans to expand the game going forward. Vermintide may not be in a genre that I usually enjoy, but this year it will enjoy being the rare exception to that rule. There are many gamers that go for the tried and true. They take the safe option and the safe road because they know that they're buying something that they'll get some fun out of. They know that they're getting their money's worth, and there is nothing wrong with that. However, in the position of a games critic, somebody that plays, frankly, far too many video games and has to do so for a living, there comes a point when you have seen far too much of the same. That point for me came like 3 or 4 years ago, and I'm still trying to deal with that fact. So when something comes along and surprises you, when something comes along and upends all of your expectations, when something comes along that blows your preconceptions out of the water, that's when you pay attention. That's when you realize why you liked video games in the first place. That's what rekindles your desire and passion for this particular medium. And there's one game that stands head and shoulders above the rest this year that was able to achieve that exact effect, and that game is Undertale. Undertale is a game about surprises. Undertale is a game about taking your expectations and throwing them overboard. Drowning them, blowing them out of the water, doing things that are consistently unexpected. The game keeps you on your toes simply because you just don't know what it's going to do next. It experiments narratively, it experiments mechanically, it experiments in terms of deliberately subverting player expectations and attempting to manipulate them to do things that perhaps they don't even know they want to do. It plays with you, it recognizes that you are a player, and it's able to work around that fact. It's even able to exploit that fact. Very few games manage that. The only one in recent memory that I can think of is the Stanley Parable. It was built entirely around that principle, screwing with your perceptions, not so much breaking the fourth wall on occasion as bulldozing it and just leaving it in a pile of rubble and saying, ha ha, look at how funny this is. Undertale screws with you all the time. It screws with you even in terms of its UI. Things leave the boundaries of where they're supposed to be on the screen. The box in which you're supposed to dodge various shaped bullets at some point might simply have a dog with a bone barking at you, or something dancing. It's a game that turns emotions into attack patterns, for God's sake. It's just so damn creative and imaginative and consistently surprising, and as a result, never dull. It's a game that quite literally takes your hand and says, hey, I have something to show you. Most striking aesthetic. The nominees for the most striking aesthetic are as follows. Renowned Explorers. Here's a little game that screenshots simply do not do justice. On first glance, looking through the Steam store, you might see what looks like a colourful, but otherwise fairly run-of-the-mill roguelike tactics game. And then you insult a sheep. It's the animation in this game that really brings it to life. It injects it with a huge dose of character and personality. I think the term cartoony graphics is thoroughly overused and perhaps misdefined when it comes to describing how games look, but I think Renowned Explorers could quite literally be a cartoon. It's that expressive, it's that colourful, and the characters are that diverse and well-defined. It is a game that, at its heart, is about exploration and light-hearted whimsy. It's fairly difficult to convey that unless you have the appropriate aesthetic. Thankfully, Renowned Explorers nails it.
They don't respond well.
Secret Ponchos. Here's a game that I got the pleasure of watching evolve. No, not that evolve, we don't like that. I saw this game at PAX 2013, a prototype, and I thought it had a little bit of promise. But coming back in 2015 and actually getting to play the finished product, this is a rookie studio working on a passion project that somehow, on their first go, managed to really nail their artistic vision. This is a hyper-stylish, Western-inspired arena game. Everything from the score screen to the options menu to the lobby oozes this hyper-stylized, graphic novel-esque Western charm, but it's the character design, I think, that is the outstanding aspect of this game's art direction. Every single character looks truly unique. I like to think that one of the key aspects of creating a really great aesthetic is whether or not that aesthetic really draws me into the world to the point where I wish to know more about it. Secret Ponchos doesn't really have a huge amount of lore, and it certainly doesn't have a story campaign, but based on the way that it's presented and just how great the characters are, well, I'd play a story-driven game in that world, I really would. Ori and the Blind Forest. That goddamn giant bird. That, I think, was the first thing that I recall from Ori and the Blind Forest. It was striking, intimidating, and it looked incredible. So does the rest of the game, as it turns out. It's a game that remembers that we actually have quite a lot of colors to choose from. It's a game with an incredible, ethereal, fairy tale sort of look to it. It's a game with a unified, cohesive aesthetic that just oozes beauty at every possible turn. This, along with a select few premium indie games, is the sort of thing that confuses people when you try and talk about best graphics. Because I wouldn't necessarily disagree if someone turned around and said, well, Ori has the best graphics this year. I mean, yeah, I guess maybe it kinda did. It might not be a technical marvel, but it really all comes down to personal perception. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and Ori just oozes beauty always, all the time, consistently. It's pretty hard to top a game that does that. Gravity Ghost. Here is a game with an uncomplicated aesthetic. It's unfair to call it simple, but it is fair to say that it lacks the unnecessary details. It focuses on what I really view to be something of a chalk or colored pencil kind of art direction, evoking very much the feeling of an illustrated children's storybook. This feeling is further hammered home by the style in which the cutscenes are presented. Not certainly the most well animated, no doubt about that, but there's something about them which reminds me of old kids' TV shows I used to watch back in the 80s, old BBC programming for young children. There was just something about Gravity Ghost, something enchanting in the way that it was presented. It's almost the anti-Ori. Ori's a game about constantly bombarding you with riotous color and beauty at every possible opportunity, whereas Gravity Ghost has a much more relaxed aesthetic as opposed to an assault on the senses. It's a relaxing aesthetic, it's soothing to look at, and I think there's quite a lot of value there. Bloodborne. Here's a game that's anything but soothing. This is a game that's goddamn terrifying, and the aesthetic has a great deal to do with that. You may remember a video that I created earlier in the year entitled The Failure of an Indie Platformer. It was discussing a game called Airscape, a platformer that had sold almost no copies, and the developer was trying to explain as to why he thought that was. One of the reasons he gave was that perhaps the relatively difficult nature of the game combined with its genre had created a fundamental dissonance with the aesthetic of the title. A cutesy little game involving a squid just didn't really make a great deal of sense, and it brought up a very interesting discussion on the idea that perhaps the difficulty of a game should somehow impact its aesthetic. Bloodborne is the opposite of Airscape. It is exactly what you would expect out of a game that is out to kill you and terrify you in the process. Bloodborne's aesthetic is consistently intimidating. It's consistently foreboding. It is consistently threatening you at all possible opportunities. There simply does not seem to be a break from it. Its artistic influences are certainly worn on its sleeve. The world is obviously inspired by Lovecraftian themes, and I don't think I'd be completely off base to suggest that there is just a dash of H.R. Geiger in there. One way or the other, you've got to admire not only just how good this game looks, but how well designed the environments are, and how in doing so they're able to passively tell the story of this world. That's something From Software have come perhaps to specialize in, and some will argue that perhaps the original Dark Souls was the master of this, whereas Bloodborne didn't do it quite as well. But I think it's the evolution upon the Dark Souls art style that really got me interested in Bloodborne. The game conveys a fundamental sense of wrongness to almost everything you're doing. And I have to say that if you wish to be inspired by H.P. Lovecraft, that sense of wrongness is not only preferable, but required, if you really want to nail it. And thankfully, that's exactly what Bloodborne does. This is a really tough category to call. it is unbelievably subjective, as you might imagine. When I mention beauty is in the eye of the beholder, that's something that is constantly the case when it comes to discussing art style in games. It's very easy to impress somebody and have them say, yeah, great graphics, when you show them high texture resolution and shiny lighting effects. It's much more difficult to argue with somebody on the subject of art direction and aesthetic, which is why I've chosen not to do it and instead lecture you with a really long video. In perhaps one of the most arbitrary choices that I could make, I'm going to go with Bloodborne as the eventual winner of most striking aesthetic, because that's what the category is. It's about being striking in some way. And yes, Bloodborne is a game in which you are constantly taken aback, you're constantly made to feel uncomfortable, and a lot of that comes down to the design and art direction of the world and the creatures within it. I could go one step further and say that Bloodborne's art style is maybe the result of the melding of Western influences such as H.P. Lovecraft and H.R. Geiger with a distinctly Japanese way of doing things. And if you want any evidence whatsoever as to the great things, the awesome artistic creations that can come from that cultural cross-pollination, then you've got Bloodborne right there as one of many examples. If I could sum up the aesthetic of Bloodborne in one word, in one emotion, it would be this: dread. The Sharpened Pitchfork Award for Dodgiest Games Company of the Year. The nominations for the award that no one really wants to get are as follows. Konami. This was certainly the company that got the most attention for its shenanigans in 2015, and it ran the gamut. This is a company that has made it abundantly clear they want out of the AAA games industry, and they seem to be doing their utmost to break as much crockery as possible on their way out of the kitchen. After their cancellation of the much-anticipated Silent Hills, Konami decided to rub salt in the wound by unveiling a Silent Hill-themed pachinko machine. Yes, that's the Japanese equivalent of a slot machine. Exactly what you think of when it comes to the cerebral and terrifying, slow-paced horror that is Silent Hill. Hit the lever, the machine exclaims enthusiastically, wondering exactly why it has the word Silent Hill written on it. That wasn't, of course, the only venerated franchise they decided to take out the back of the woodshed and fill full of buckshot before gleefully swinging its bleeding corpse around like a child with a balloon. Castlevania was not immune to the pachinko treatment. After the piss-poor Lords of Shadow 2, we get treated to an erotic violence pachinko machine, because Lord knows if I associate anything with Castlevania, it is erotic violence. What exactly is that, anyway? Actually, you know what? I don't want to know. Those little elements are merely the tip of the iceberg, however. The more insidious, the more downright evil activities that Konami engaged in this year included issuing DMCA takedown requests against journalistic videos. This is a literal case, a very literal case, of a company abusing a copyright claim system in order to censor things they didn't like. There have been several cases of Japanese publishers being very trigger-happy and childish when it came to criticism on YouTube, but Konami really takes the cake with that one. Its blatant disregard for consumers continued with the introduction of microtransactions into the primarily single-player game of Metal Gear Solid 5, as well as its forced boot camp for reviewers, which resulted in almost nobody noticing that the last third of the game was a little bit of an unfinished mess. Everything here, however, pales in comparison to the accusations that have been leveled at Konami in regards to the treatment of its employees and its seemingly hostile relationship with Hideo Kojima, the creator of Metal Gear Solid 5 and of course the head of Kojima Productions. The sheer number of accusations is simply unreal. And of course, the cherry on top of this gâteau of dickery had to be Konami under the threat of legal action preventing Hideo Kojima from attending the Game Awards in America to accept awards on behalf of Metal Gear Solid 5. When it comes to Konami this year, the bad news just never seemed to end, and I found myself saying, I want the hell off of Mr. Konami's wild ride. Overkill. Here is a company that started as something of an indie darling producing an incredibly popular cooperative shooter by the name of Payday 2. This is a company that made promises and was viewed as very consumer-friendly in its practices. And what we've seen with Overkill over a number of years is the gradual slip towards the dark side. Overkill were nailed to the wall earlier this year as a result of a clear broken promise with the introduction of microtransactions into Payday 2, something they had explicitly said would never happen. Furthermore, these microtransactions involved random drop crates, which generated cosmetic skins. However, in a move that baffles me in terms of the sheer lack of common sense, these skins actually provided legitimate in-game benefits to damage, accuracy, and more besides. It's one thing to introduce microtransactions explicitly after you said and promised that you would not. It is quite another to do them in one of the most egregious ways possible. This is perhaps an example of a studio truly losing its way after somebody in a key leadership position left the company, specifically David Goldfarb, who was the lead designer and was the one that stated that the game would not ever have microtransactions. Trust in Overkill had been gradually eroding. The content development strategy of the studio post-launch was starting to annoy players. The sheer amount of it, the excessive nature of it, and indeed a fundamental change in the kind of content that they decided to sell versus what they implemented free were causing quite a few players to lose faith. Also, those that elected to play it on console had been dealing with a game that lacked updates and had been broken in many ways since its launch. It actually took months to get a response out of Overkill since the release of Payday 2 on Xbox One, and the developer promised to fix the game by the end of 2015. Well, at the time of recording, it is the end of 2015, and unless I'm very much mistaken, the last update for consoles was update 1.04 that was released, oh yes, in October. As of December the 11th in 2015, Overkill had promised that the matchmaking fix update had been sent out, but as of the time of recording this, it has yet to be implemented and, of course, much less tested. EA. It wouldn't be a Sharpened Pitchfork award without EA. One of the biggest criticisms of the company this year comes from a fairly recent release, Star Wars Battlefront. The game has been widely criticized for a lack of launch content and the aggressive pushing of the Season Pass DLC. With further content promised over the course of 2016 with the Season Pass, many gamers have decided to refer to Battlefront as a $110 game as opposed to a $60 game. To add insult to that monetization injury, arguably the best gun in the game was offered at level 1 to those that purchased the Digital Deluxe Edition, whereas everybody else, well, you have to wait till an extremely high level. This resulted, of course, in an early power gap between players that had access to a gun that, at least on paper, appeared to be the best in the game by a significant margin, and those that did not. This is the kind of problem that generally irons itself out over time, but you can forgive people for being just a little bit suspicious when a gun that good just happens to be a level 1 unlock in the edition that costs more money. Pleasantly enough, we didn't see too many online server shutdowns for EA games in 2015, although several free-to-play titles loaded with microtransactions did in fact shut down in July, including Battlefield Play for Free, Battlefield Heroes, FIFA World, and Need for Speed World. Unfortunately, it appears that its iOS titles were not quite so safe, and a large number of EA games were pulled from the App Store this year as EA cited an unwillingness to continue to support the titles. This includes some surprisingly good titles such as Burnout Crash and Flight Control, both of which were fairly early successes on iOS. One thing is certain, there continues to be an air of suspicion amongst consumers regarding EA, and it could take a great deal of work to eventually dispel that. Digital homicide. Every now and again, there's an indie studio that does something incredibly stupid. Previous examples, of course, include Wild Game Studios, the developers of the abomination that is Day One Gary's Incident, and Fun Creators, the least honest name for a company in human history. But honestly, I think that both of those examples pale in comparison to the continued belligerence of Digital Homicide, the purveyor of consistently awful video games on Steam. For some reason, Digital Homicide has entered into an almost wrestling-like feud with critic and fellow YouTuber Jim Sterling. It all started with a false DMCA claim against a scathing first look at a title called The Slaughtering Grounds, which is unapologetically terrible. The company continued to feud with Jim Sterling over the issue of the DMCAs long after YouTube had rejected them as invalid. The company engaged in what could only be described as puerile character assassination, and when a representative finally sat down to talk across the table from Jim Sterling, he frankly came across as barking mad. This is a company that has somehow survived by creating absolute shovelware, which primarily consists of games hastily constructed from pre-bought Unity assets. They have also gone out of their way to shill some of these titles under fake trade names, one assumes as a result of the Digital Homicide brand being radioactive. Worse still, one of these fake names appears to be guilty of trademark infringement. There is an actual Polish mobile game company developer named ECC Games that had to go out of its way to explain that they have absolutely nothing to do with the abominations known as Devil's Share or Galactic Hitman. Speaking of Galactic Hitman, it owns the extremely dubious honor of being the lowest rated game that exists on the Steam platform. Some might say it's better to reign in hell than serve in heaven, but let's be honest, Digital Homicide is doing neither of those things. Square Enix. After a good few years for Square Enix, unfortunately, 2015 has featured a number of questionable decisions from the publisher. Foremost in my mind is of course an issue near and dear to my heart. One of the most egregious pre-order schemes for a title that I've ever seen, and it just so happened to be the successor to my favorite franchise ever, Deus Ex: Mankind Divided. This augment your pre-order scheme, as they called it, promised numerous tiers of rewards based on how many people pre-ordered the game. The final tier appeared to involve the game releasing 4 days early, although it's not exactly known whether this would have been for everybody or egregiously for merely those that had pre-ordered. Worse still, some of the tiers had mutually exclusive rewards, meaning it was literally impossible to get everything unless you pre-ordered multiple copies of the game. These bonuses ran the gamut from cosmetics to things that would actually affect gameplay. The massive public backlash to this scheme eventually resulted in the publisher choosing to shelve the project. Square Enix also found itself in trouble with iOS users after having one of its classic RPGs, The World Ends With You, break on iOS 8 and remain broken for months without any response from Square Enix at all. It's worth noting, of course, that Square Enix iOS games are some of the most expensive on the platform, but it would appear that this higher price did not in fact translate into better customer service and technical support. It took months for the game to be fixed, only to have it break once again on iOS 9, and it took Square Enix until the end of the year to release an update that made the game work again. Alongside these obvious mistakes is some scrutiny in regards to upcoming business models for the releases of new games from Square Enix. Earlier in the year, the new Hitman title, which has yet to be released, was confirmed to be coming out in a content-incomplete state. Now, while Square Enix stressed specifically that it's not an early access game, suspicions are fairly high as to just how much content, a sizable chunk, according to Square Enix, will be available on launch. The notion of purchasing a clearly unfinished game for full price is obviously something that has certain gamers nervous, and the recent announcement that the Final Fantasy VII remake will be coming in multiple episodes has not exactly done much to instill confidence in longtime customers. You know, I have to give credit to the games industry this year. You managed to not screw up quite as badly as 2014, and that's worthy of celebration. Congratulations, you did the thing that you were supposed to do. That's not to say, of course, that 2015 has been perfect, far from it, and some of the companies on this list have been guilty of missteps. There is a difference, however, between missteps, even suicidal petulance when it comes to your professionalism, and Konami. Konami, obviously, without a shadow of a doubt, stands apart from everything else on this list as just being orders of magnitude worse They appear to be playing piss off the consumer bingo, doing everything possible to destroy the legacy of what once was a great company with some really good franchises under its belt. It takes a lot of work to be consistently awful over the course of an entire year. Konami somehow managed to achieve that. Konami has proven itself to be an unethical company with no regard to its consumers or indeed the legacy of its franchises, and frankly, I am glad to see them go. Go roll in the income of your pachinko machines. Just get the hell out of everybody else's way while you do it. Developer of the Year. The nominations for the Developer of the Year award are as follows. CD Projekt Red. CD Projekt in general has been known for quite some time for its consumer-friendly practices, whether it be its commitment to DRM-free gaming through the GOG.com platform that it owns and operates, or the release of free updates and DLC for titles such as The Witcher 2. However, this year they released The Witcher 3, and this tendency to provide meaningful content updates for free has continued. The Witcher 3 has received no less than 16 pieces of free DLC, although of course some have argued, perhaps rightfully so, that some of this content was probably time delayed from the release of the game as opposed to being something that was developed after the release of the title. Regardless, this has been received very well, as you might expect, and their actual paid DLC release has also reviewed well across the board. With The Witcher 3, CD Projekt Red developed a Game of the Year candidate that, as far as I'm concerned, does a great deal to contribute to the wonderful diversity of our beloved medium. Expertly bringing Slavic mythology, something that is not necessarily exposed all that often to a primarily Americentric audience, is, as far as I'm concerned, an achievement. The Witcher 3 brings the stories, culture, and mythology of an otherwise underrepresented nation to the world in an expert fashion. That's worthy of celebration. That is worthy of lauding as progress within our industry, and that is worth lauding when it comes to talking about diversity in video games. The Witcher 3 is the essence of diversity in video games. DICE LA. It might be curious to find on the list of Developers of the Year a studio that hasn't actually made its own game yet. DICE LA was a support studio founded in 2013, and its job over the past year has been the maintenance and updating of the title Battlefield 4. As those of you who bought the title on release are probably keenly aware, Battlefield 4 was a technical mess, something of a disaster on launch. What may surprise you, if you haven't been paying attention, is that the game is now anything but, and that is thanks to the efforts of DICE LA. This is a studio that took what was an incredibly complex piece of software that was fundamentally broken on many levels and turned it into a game that could be strongly considered as one of the best AAA shooters currently available on the PC platform. As a result of their support, frequent updates, fixes, and of course free DLC, which continues with the recent release of the classic Dragon Valley map, DICE LA is something of an unsung hero. To me, they rescued a game that should have been a hell of a lot better than it was, and they made it the game it was supposed to be to begin with. I don't think they get anywhere near enough credit for that. Developers should be commended for continued post-launch support. They should be commended for fixing the problems at release and going above and beyond in order to do that, especially considering the game is now 2 years old, and it would not have surprised anyone, I think, to see EA quickly abandon it in favor of Battlefield Hardline and Star Wars Battlefront. Thankfully, that didn't happen, and the guys responsible for all the heavy lifting are DICE LA. Of particular note are the reports of excellent working conditions at DICE LA and the steps that the studio has taken to avoid the so-called dreaded crunch. The concept of crunch in game development is, in my opinion, not highlighted anywhere near enough. It is, of course, the unethical overworking of developers in order to meet key deadlines to the point where some of these people don't get to see their families for weeks on end and end up sleeping under their desks. There have been plenty of horror stories from AAA studios as to the realities of crunch time, and it's frankly something that should be condemned where possible within the games industry. Game developers already work long enough hours as it is. The last thing you need is to try and work them to death. Any studio that is leading the way in terms of obliterating this so-called crunch is a studio that, to me, deserves recognition for doing just that. Blizzard Entertainment. Well, I think everybody knows that I have had my issues with Blizzard over the last 5 or 6 years. It's certainly a company that I hold a great deal of respect for, but simultaneously, I think I've criticized their decisions perhaps more so than any other studio over the last few years of my career. In 2014, I would have to admit a great deal of misgivings for some of the decisions and ideas that Blizzard came up with, whether it be the fundamentally broken artifact system for Heroes of the Storm, which was thankfully shelved, whether it be the lackluster support of Diablo 3, or whether it be a seeming lack of commitment to fairness and feature implementation in Hearthstone, a game that was clearly making far more money than its threadbare nature justified. While we're still lacking those infamous extra deck slots, Blizzard has surprisingly turned a great corner, in my opinion, in 2015, and the main reason for that is communication. I cannot tell you how frustrated I've been with Blizzard over the last decade when it comes to communicating with its audience. It's been terrible at it. I ran a fan site for 6 years, and getting any sort of communication out of them that didn't involve being blacklisted was nigh on impossible. When it came to StarCraft, it seemed that the game that I loved perhaps more so than any when it came to esports was being taken in the wrong direction, and Blizzard was stubbornly unwilling to listen to its player base. However, in 2015, they have gone a long way to addressing those particular concerns. The communication process during the Legacy of the Void beta was extremely impressive, and the frequent and logical answers to community feedback continue to come after the release of the final expansion pack for StarCraft 2. A renewed promise of support for the game, as well as a promising timeline of future updates and content, has left the player base significantly more confident in StarCraft 2's future. And this has some degree also applied to Diablo 3, which continues to receive support and updates and is certainly a significantly better game than it was on release. Finally, while Hearthstone continues to suffer various problems, the latest adventure release has shaken up the metagame significantly, and the introduction of tavern brawls as well as the end-of-season chest rewards have addressed some concerns that the Hearthstone ladder was simply not a compelling place to play. The game has quite a long way to go, and Blizzard is by no means perfect, but I think there's a marked improvement here, and at least in my eyes, that deserves recognition. Kojima Productions. We may never know the full story of the development of Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain, the continued rows involving lawyers between Kojima and Konami. We may never know exactly what the problem was, where the antagonistic nature of Konami came from, what exactly Hideo Kojima had done to deserve the treatment that he received. Regardless, while not a perfect game, the fact that Metal Gear Solid 5 even got released at all, especially in the excellent state that it was, is nothing short of a miracle. It seems that the hostile working environment was severely affecting both Kojima and his team, and Konami just couldn't wait to get them out of the door. The conflict between the two entities, to me, represents the tension between the businessmen and the artist. And while few here can truly say that they know Kojima as a person, I doubt many would agree that he was deserving of all the disrespect and ill treatment that Konami perpetrated, up to and including the petulant decision to remove Kojima's name from the cover of what he hoped to be his magnum opus. I dearly hope that with the recent announcement that Kojima had moved on and is in talks to establish a new studio, that Kojima is finally able to actually work in an environment that suits his particular talents. The last thing I imagine that any creative person wants is to grow to despise the very medium which is supposed to ignite your passion. I certainly hope that everybody from Kojima Productions ends up landing on their feet and are given the opportunities that they clearly deserve. How does one even define the developer of the year? Actually, I had an argument with somebody on Gamasutra about this. I disagreed with a couple of entries in his list, and we had a little lively discussion about it, and it allowed me to reach my own personal conclusion on the subject. To me, the developer of the year is not merely somebody that created a good game. Lots of studios create good games. It's a studio that distinguished itself by going above and beyond. For many people, I have absolutely no doubt that the developer of the year is CD Projekt Red. However, while they are an absolutely excellent developer and no doubt worthy of the praise that they are receiving and the accolades that are currently being showered upon them, I have to give it to DICE LA. I genuinely think that studios like this are the unsung heroes of our industry. Game development seems very glamorous from the outside. It seems like the sort of thing that could allow you to become a rock star, no pun intended. And these rockstar game developers, the well-known developers, are used to receiving all of the praise for the most popular games of the year. The people that don't generally receive the praise are the guys working away in the background to make sure the damn thing doesn't fall apart. They are studios that are committed to working on somebody else's dream, rather than being able to fully realize their own. In such a creative industry, I have to imagine that that can't be an easy thing to do. And when it comes to DICE LA, this is a studio that rescued somebody else's dream and made it a reality for all of the people that purchased it in the first place. They took what should have been great and they made it great. They provided the support that game needed long after the game's release. They continued to update it with great content, and as a result, that game is now fantastic. I dearly hope that they get the opportunity to make something of their own. And I'm not the only person to think that. EA Studios executive Patrick Soderlund said it was highly likely that DICE LA would create its own game, and the CEO of EA himself, Andrew Wilson, described DICE LA as a really passionate group of people, and he said that there was no doubt that the studio would eventually build a game of its own. Rockstar game developers win this award all the time. These awards are purely arbitrary, so I choose to give it, for once, to an unsung studio that worked its arse off and deserves a bit of recognition for that. The game that most needs to see the light of Gabe Newell. The nominations for the award of Game That Most Needs to See the Light of Gabe Newell, aka Should Be on Bloody PC, are as follows. Until Dawn. This is a game that looks great and plays terribly, and the reason for that is because it looks great. What are you talking about, you might say? Well, it's a game that pushes the graphical boundaries of what that platform can achieve, and as it turns out, it can't achieve all that much. It looks great, at the expense of frame rate, at the expense of expansive environments, at the expense of a lack of loading screens, and so on and so forth. Similar to the shallow showpiece that was Order 1886, this PlayStation 4 exclusive looks the part until you see it in motion and try to control it. It's an incredibly atmospheric game with some really impressive effects that deserves to be played on better hardware. Unfortunately, that's not particularly likely to happen. Supermassive Games have for the last few years been developing exclusively for the PlayStation platform, and considering the value of Until Dawn as an exclusive, you can bet your ass that Sony will want to keep it that way. It's also worth noting the mechanics tied into the gyroscopic features of the DualShock 4, and while of course you can use a DualShock 4 with a PC, not everybody has one, and that's a further excuse not to move it to this platform. Bloodborne. You need only look at the popularity of Dark Souls 1 and 2 as justification for this title coming to the PC platform. Dark Souls, despite being one of the worst ports in known memory, still ended up being a fantastic game as the result of the efforts of modders. Dark Souls is still a highly played game on PC with thousands of concurrent players at any given time despite its age, and Dark Souls 2 was well received and indeed demonstrated exactly what would happen if you took a little bit of time to take advantage of the PC's capabilities. Dark Souls at 60 frames per second is fantastic, an objectively better experience than Dark Souls at 30, and considering the increase in speed of the combat in Bloodborne, I can safely say that Bloodborne would only benefit further from an upgrade to 60 frames per second or higher. It's also worth noting that even after the various patches, the load times for Bloodborne are still somewhat lengthy on the PlayStation 4, and I imagine that the addition of a nice speedy SSD to the mix would probably solve some of those issues. Rise of the Tomb Raider. This is a game that is coming to PC in January. It should have come to PC at the same bloody time as it came to Xbox One. This is of course a series that has been at home on PC ever since its inception, and the recent reboot did extremely well on PC, and was by far the best looking version of the game. It is in my eyes a fundamentally disappointing move to take a franchise that was multi-platform and decide to put it on a single platform even if it's just in a timed exclusivity period. That is disappointing to fans of the franchise, that is anti-consumer, and by the looks of the relatively poor sales performance of Rise of the Tomb Raider, although I imagine quite a lot of that has to do with just how competitive its launch date was, I can safely say that the game would have done a hell of a lot better if they just released it on all platforms to begin with. Halo 5 Guardians. I'm gonna keep doing this. I'm gonna keep saying it until it happens. Halo should be on PC. There's no reason for it not to be on PC outside of the exclusive nature of this particular title. It's perfect for PC. It's a shooter, a sci-fi shooter. I mean, hell, Halo was originally intended to be a PC game in the first place. Considering Microsoft's more recent claims that they're interested in actually supporting the PC platform again with Windows 10, there's been surprisingly little noise about bringing the games that people actually want from the Xbox One over to the PC. Every now and again, it seems that we get a little table scrap announced, such as the eventual port of Gears of War Ultimate Edition, whenever that happens. The release of Fable Legends, a game which may or may not be okay, and I'd probably just prefer Fable 2. One way or the other, if Microsoft wants us to truly believe that they're committed to Windows 10 as a gaming platform, they'll bring out their heavy hitters to prove it. I personally believe it is a fallacy to suggest that just because you don't release a game on PC, people will go and buy a console to play it. I have no intention of playing Halo on console. I don't like playing shooters with controllers. Who the hell would if they're used to using keyboard and mouse? It's never gonna happen. I don't care how long you hold it out. I'd rather just not play it at all than play it on a platform with a controller that I truly hate. I doubt this exclusivity causes PC gamers to go out and buy an Xbox One. I certainly do not doubt that holding Halo hostage on the Xbox One has resulted in lost sales. When people ask me what console games should come to PC, I'm always going to answer all of them. There is absolutely no reason whatsoever not to bring your games to PC when PC is as flexible a platform and continues to grow in popularity. Console exclusives have and always will be an anti-consumer practice, holding games hostage in order to sell their machine over the other machine. We've seen some evidence in recent years that the PC is being used as some sort of neutral middle ground for titles such as Street Fighter V and Titanfall. Regardless, I would love to see every game on this list on this platform. One of them is coming, which is great. The other three, not so much, and the one that I would prefer the most has to be Bloodborne. It makes perfect sense for this game to be on PC. It's the ideal hardcore audience. The popularity of Dark Souls and Dark Souls 2 on this platform is proof positive that this genre works here and that it is desired. Is it gonna happen? Probably not. It's a Sony exclusive. It's tied intrinsically to Sony. They are involved in it directly. They are not gonna let PC gamers play it. As a result, I've simply resorted to watching it. You might wonder why I could possibly know anything about the aesthetic of this game. That's because I've watched it pretty much from start to finish. It's intriguing. But I don't want to play it at 30 frames per second. I certainly don't want to see it drop below 30 frames per second in PvP, which it bloody well does. I don't want to have to wait that long to respawn. It's not just that gamers deserve better, it's that that game deserves better than to be shackled on a platform like that. It deserves to be able to reach its full potential, because it's a great game, and it's being held back by the limitations of the technology that it finds itself imprisoned within. Kinda sucks, honestly. But there you go. I'd like to see Bloodborne. Never will, but I'd like to see it. The Contrarian Award for the game that I didn't like as much as everyone else did. The nominations for the Contrarian Award are as follows. Rocket League. I didn't get it. The enthusiasm surrounding Rocket League is something that thoroughly passed me by. I saw it, I looked out the window, there was a carnival going on, a parade, fireworks everywhere, everybody loves Rocket League. And I'm thinking to myself, I don't necessarily see the appeal. To me, it really comes down to the fact that I just don't like football. And that's what this game is. There's no hiding it. It's a sports game. It's football. It's football with cars. I am bloody terrible at it, but I have no desire to get any better because I never found it interesting to begin with. Honestly, I play video games to do things that I can't do in real life. And you might say, well, you can't drive a car into a ball. You're right, but I can play football, which is kind of the same thing. It's a cool spin on the beautiful game, and in fact, weirdly enough, it might be more of a football game than actual football games are, considering the direct control that you have over where the ball goes. But I don't dig it. I don't even dig it with friends. I've tried to like Rocket League, and I just can't do it. It just doesn't enthuse me. Fallout 4. Talk about the hype machine in motion this year for plenty of titles, but perhaps none as much as Fallout 4. This game apparently can do no wrong. Despite releasing, as usual, in a buggy mess of a state like every other Bethesda game, this title received a universal acclaim. And really, it's only a month or so on from release that it is starting to receive some criticism that had previously been shouted down by enthusiastic fans. Bethesda seems to get away with murder so often. They release games that are buggy, they release games that have huge worlds but generally the depth of a paddling pool, but they get away with it consistently. I'm not saying that Fallout 4 is a bad game, it's not. I think it's a bad RPG. I think that the role-playing aspects have been absolutely castrated in favor of more shooty bang bang and lots of crafting and this settlement building thing that I don't really have much interest in engaging in. But this is a game that received like 9.5s and 10s when the technical issues alone should have saddled it with a lower score. All scores are stupid, of course, but regardless of that, I have had a great amount of difficulty getting into Fallout 4. I have difficulty getting past the UI, the performance problems, the various bugs on PC, and one of the key aspects of the Fallout series that has stood out, that being the in-depth dialogue system, has basically been gutted. It's pick one of 4 extremely vague little prompts, which may or may not say the thing that you actually want, and the skill-based dialogue options of old seem to be curiously absent in favor of just either having high enough charisma or not. I don't feel like I'm role-playing a character in this game because I simply don't have the tools to really do any actual role-playing. I feel like a pair of trousers that's walking around trying to fill itself with as many spare parts as possible so that I can build another gun. Those aspects are fine in and of themselves, but I expected a Fallout game and I was treated to a glorified Far Cry. Just Cause 3. I desperately wanted to love Just Cause 3. Just Cause 2 at the time for me was a paradigm shift in open world gaming. It offered a lot of things that other games at the time simply did not do in that genre. The sheer scale, the amount of destruction, and the potential for shenanigans and emergent gameplay through wacky physics. Just Cause 3 should have blown that game out of the water. Unfortunately, it seems like open world games have advanced greatly over the last 5 years since the release of Just Cause 2, and Just Cause 3 doesn't seem to have kept up. Despite a sprawling island world, and quite frankly a beautiful one at that, this game is highly repetitive. It hasn't advanced all that much from Just Cause 2, and really seems to offer the same but prettier. Some questionable design decisions when it comes to unlocking the various abilities that let you have fun to begin with, and the sheer amount of dull filler activities leave me with the feeling that I just don't want to go and liberate yet another town. I just don't want to go blow up another army base, because it is all the same over and over and over again. Just Cause 3 could have benefited greatly from the addition of co-op, or indeed just some feature to really distinguish itself from its predecessor that I, again, must remind you is 5 years old. Just Cause 2 actually has multiplayer thanks to the modding scene. As a result, Just Cause 3 feels like a step backwards. And even though many people are enthused by the wacky physics and crazy moments that you can find on YouTube, I found myself disappointingly nonplussed by what I was able to do in that game. Ark Survival Evolved. I'm going to admit it, I just don't get multiplayer survival games. I never have. The concept seems sound in theory, and I can understand certainly the tension of permadeath and losing everything that you've worked to build, but simultaneously, I don't have time for that. And I don't want to see all of that stuff go up in smoke, which quite frankly is the reason I don't play EVE anymore. One way or the other, early access survival games seem to be something of a contradiction. They are games that rely on your ability to stay alive, yet they're obviously buggy, unfinished, and unbalanced, and as a result, your ability to stay alive is often at the mercy of whether or not the game decides to work properly. Early access survival games have something of a nomadic player base, roaming from game to game to game as early access titles are announced, released, and subsequently kind of abandoned. It's weird. It's like it's a genre that has almost no finished games in it. The only real game that has been finished would have to be Don't Starve. Everything else is still in early access, despite the fact that the so-called progenitor of the genre in its modern form, DayZ, remains unfinished 3 bloody years after the release of the original mod. From an outsider's perspective, Ark looks to be the same song and dance, but with dinosaurs in it. Hopefully they actually finish this one, and I will admit that the development schedule for this game looks like it's been consistent, and they're continually updating the game with the things that people want. That's great. You have fun over there, I don't want any part of it. It's easy to claim that somebody's a contrarian simply for the sake of it. I have very specific preferences and very limited time. It's certainly understandable, I think, that I wouldn't like certain titles, especially considering how bloody jaded I seem to be to a lot of them. This list is a combination of games that I should have liked but didn't, and games that I really had no interest in the first place, and yet are certainly not inexplicably popular, in fact quite the opposite, just things that have passed me by. I'm having my own personal you damn kids with your music moment here. One way or the other, one of these titles does indeed stand above the rest in the way that I've been outspoken about it and flat out refuse to be enthusiastic about it, and that's Rocket League. I don't like football. I don't care how you dress it up. Some people might claim, well, you play Blood Bowl. One, that's American football, not the same thing. Real football, hand egg, not really the same thing. Secondly, of course, Blood Bowl is basically a strategy game, not a sports game. Rocket League is certainly a sports game, and I don't like sports games. I don't care how you dress it up, I don't like sports games. I can see the appeal of a team-based game such as Rocket League and those clutch sort of esports MLG moments. That's cool, but I want to get those moments from genres that I actually enjoy, such as first-person shooters or strategy games, and Rocket League is neither of those games. It also happens to be the game that I think I've been pestered to look at the most, and as a result, I'm sick of you asking. Look, I don't just call them the Arbitrary awards for no reason. If you've got this far into the video, you know exactly what to expect. The It's Finally Done award for best game to come out of early access. The nominations for our final category, appropriately so, are as follows. Sunless Sea. In my experience, roguelite games developed through the early access program run the risk of not having enough content. Indeed, every roguelite game runs that risk because you are relying on replayability, and that replayability comes from the variety of each playthrough, which is often driven by progress that you can do sort of on a meta level with your overall game account. Sunless Sea takes even more risks by being narratively focused. It's much more difficult to pack a game full of content that you want to see over and over again if the focus of that content is on written stories. Regardless, Sunless Sea continually adds new tales to the game, and has a huge amount of written content that is thoroughly immersive and really dragged me into a very intriguing world. It's also worth noting that a key feature of the game was changed in early access, and that was of course the combat system. Prior to that, it was something of a clunky turn-based affair, and I think I could have done without that. It's already a slow-paced enough game as it is. I don't really think that a game that isn't actually that focused on combat should be spending so much time forcing you to do it. It's not like the combat system is perfect now, but it's nice to streamline it in favor of allowing me to explore the world and find out cool things once more. Kerbal Space Program. The weird little indie game that could and suddenly became a hit pretty much out of nowhere, or did it? Did it really become a hit out of nowhere? Because I imagine a lot of its success has got to do with its ethical, well-developed early access program. This is a game in which the developers are very communicative, responded well to feedback, and of course fully supported the modding scene, which helped the game truly flourish. How the hell do you determine when to bring a game that actually has no concrete end game to market and out of the early access system? When do you know that it's ready? That's a very good question. One that you would have to ask the Kerbal Space Program devs, because they realized it. Plenty of early access games come out too early and half-baked. And those are games that actually have a legitimate end of the game, an actual start, middle, and ending. Kerbal doesn't. And yet, they managed to bring it out with enough content to keep people satisfied, and that game continues to be developed and be incredibly popular. It's a success story in an obscure genre, assuming that you can even call it a genre, and it's a great example of a game developing well as a result of a good dialogue between the early access customers and the development team. Prison Architect. The architect, perhaps, of this entire business model, one of the earliest early access games, originally available as alpha funding through the developer's website before being transferred to the Steam early access system. It certainly was not Minecraft, arguably one of the first games to really do this, but it's a poster child for Steam's early access system. It's a game with a ton of content that, again, was well developed and frequently updated. The amount of time that it actually spent in early access was surprising. This was a 3-year early access development cycle, and it involved frequent updates every 3 to 4 weeks, and it was a riotous success. It's a game that managed to shift over 1 million copies before being released. It is one of the most financially successful early access games ever made. And it's also a blueprint by which to develop properly under the early access system. They promised to update every 3 to 4 weeks, and that's exactly what they did. Over 3 years, there were 36 alpha versions. All of this gave the impression, the rightful impression, that these devs could actually be trusted. And as a result, we got a great game out of it, in a genre that unfortunately has been lacking as such in the past few years. Broforce. Why was this game in early access? Don't really know. It's not actually the sort of genre that generally ends up in the early access program. It's a side-scrolling shooter, it's a side-scrolling action game. Most of those games are just released in their complete state. For some reason, Broforce decided to go down the early access route, but as a result, it ended up with a huge cult following, not to mention a massive amount of content. One of the smart things that the developers' free lives did was give early access to the level editor in 2014. That allowed a huge amount of user-generated content to be created prior to the game's actual launch. What did that result in? An incredible value proposition for those of us that had waited for the game to leave early access. While it might be a fairly weird genre to put through the early access program, in this case it absolutely worked out, and it's a better game for it. As a rule, I don't really like the early access system. I feel it's risky, it's open to abuse, and money can simply disappear into a black hole never to return. I would, in the vast majority of circumstances, not recommend early access games to the people that watch my channel. I think there are plenty of perfectly good, finished games available that you could throw your money at, and being a patient consumer is beneficial to you. That said, I am not going to deny that early access can produce some great games, and that early access resulted in the improvement of those games, as opposed to a more traditional business model. The game that stands head and shoulders above the rest when it comes to showing how early access should be done is Prison Architect. It's one of the pioneers. They started the system through their own website, they eventually moved onto the early access program through Steam, and then they did exactly what they said they were going to do and used the system in the way that it was intended. They built trust. They built a great game as a result. They took feedback and implemented it in a sensible way. And in the case of the developer Introversion Software, you have to think about the struggles that they went through prior to this. Their previous games such as Darwinia and Defcon did not sell all that well. Years of development time were sunk into a game that never materialized by the name of Subversion. Introversion were in trouble. In 2010, the company had all but shut their doors, letting go all but 4 staff as well as closing their office. They were actually saved, if you can believe it, by a Steam sale. Shifting huge numbers of copies of Defcon and Multiwinia, Introversion claims that sale gave them $250,000 in revenue. It kept the company afloat, and then they took on what, as far as I'm concerned, was a very risky venture in the form of the alpha-funded Prison Architect. And you know what? It worked. This is an example, in my opinion, of a games company saving itself through simple, honest business practice and development talent. No tricks, no nonsense, just asking, will you trust us? And then proving that they deserved that trust. For early access, this game was a model prisoner. I'm so sorry. Come on, 2 hours without a pun, it's gonna happen. Wow, we've come to the end, ladies and gentlemen, of this 2-hour show. Thank you very much if you got this far for watching the Arbitrary Awards 2015. This is the video that we put the most work into this year by a country mile. It's a big collaborative effort between myself and my graphics designer, Christian Baltok. I'd like to give him a big thank you for working as hard as he did to produce this video. I'd also like to thank all of the people that had a look over my nominations and helped me revise them and propose suggestions for categories. You all know who you are, and I certainly appreciate that you took some time out of your day to help me out with my work. Of course, last but by no means least, I should be thanking you lot for sticking around this entire time. This is going to sound curiously similar to last year. 2015 has not been a great year. I may never have a great year again, but I intend to have a lot more years regardless of whether or not they end up being great. I'm going to stick around and do what I love to do, and I'm going to keep doing that because this industry is great and because you guys obviously like the sort of thing that I put out. That's pretty cool. That's a nice feeling. I can dig that, so thank you for giving it to me. If you'd like to give me something else, you can click the like button and of course share this video. Let people watch it. Maybe they'll enjoy it, maybe they won't. Perhaps this is too long-winded, but we still got in shorter than the Game Awards. Maybe I should have asked a few more people what they thought of Star Wars Battlefront. I don't know. Anyway, thank you very much for watching the Arbitrary Awards 2015. This has been the finale video for our 2015 content. Although I imagine we're going to be sneaking a few more things out there before the end of the year. My name has been TotalBiscuit. Thank you very much once again for watching, and I'll see you next time.
My fuck Konami senses are tingling. Sorry to butt in, but I feel it's my God-given duty to give us the rundown of Konami's frankly amazing history of awful behaviour this year. The world finally cottoned on to what an immense pile of donkey spunk this company was when Silent Hills was unceremoniously cancelled and the critically acclaimed lead-in game PT was pulled from the PlayStation Store with no respect for archival or historical significance. Konami's treatment of Hideo Kojima in the public eye has been astonishing, scrubbing his name from Metal Gear Solid 5's promotion, acting like he didn't exist, pretending he was on holiday when he blatantly left the company, and finally banning him from the Game Awards to accept an award for his game. Aside from that, we've had microtransactions in MGS5, insurance policies on sale for your microtransactions in MGS5, MGS5 holding your offline resources hostage in the online mode to encourage microtransactions, Horse Armor DLC, Castlevania pachinko machines promising erotic violence, Silent Hill pachinko machines urging you to hit the lever, and revelations of atrocious working conditions in which staff are treated like scum. All the while, Konami's ignored the public and continue to grin gormlessly while the world throws tomatoes at its smug, sneering face. If you want the short version of what I just said, I got 2 words for you. Fuck Konami.